One of the problems when talking about the Crusades is there's this deliberate vacuum. That early in the 8th century, Christians do not understand in any way that this is a new religion. All of the jihads, no matter what, were very much motivated by just war, conquest, enslavement.
1095, when the first Crusade is called for by the Pope. What is the attitude and beliefs of Europeans?
This was a traumatic event, massive change that took place to the globe.
Had the Christians not engaged in just war then, all of Europe and indeed America might well be Muslim.
We have more records of what actually these Turks did than what the Arabs did, and it is some graphic stuff, okay? These Turks ran in, killing and slaughtering tens of thousands. The worst one happened in 1064. They took to death, essentially.
Do we have a sense of how many were killed?
Literally hundreds of thousands, but this would include women and children.
Now we finally come to the Knights Templar.
A total of 9 knights created a band of brotherhoods. Very soon, they essentially morphed into a elite commando force dedicated to fighting Islam. The logic became, if we want to protect Christians, then we are in de facto war with Islam.
You might shut this question down, but do you think any of the Crusades were just? Before we get into this interview, I just wanted to say that we have noticed that more than half of our regular viewers are not subscribed. If you want to support the Winston Marshall Show, all you have to do is press subscribe. If you do that, we can have more phenomenal guests exploring the issues you want to hear about that the mainstream media won't touch. But without further ado, on with the interview. Raymond Ibrahim, part 2. I'm thrilled to be sat with you again. And now you have just put out a new book, The Two Swords of Christ, 5 centuries of war between Islam and the warrior monks of Christendom, focusing on the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, which I'm hoping to get into with you in this conversation, the truth about the Crusades.
Yep.
So perhaps we should go right to the beginning. Crusades actually is an anachronistic word, right? So they weren't called it Crusades right at the beginning.
No. Yeah, it kind of codified later, but they were always essentially tied to the idea of taking the cross. Right. In different languages. And so crusade comes from different languages, Spanish, French, Latin, Italian, for cross, right. Taking the cross. I think it starts becoming called that maybe a couple of centuries after.
After. But take me to Europe in that time. Now, we have covered in our last conversation the Islamic conquest of Europe, and it was a sweeping chat about basically the long-forgotten history. We don't need to do it all now, but It's worth remembering or revisiting the mood and what it was like in Europe and the attitudes towards the Islamic world from the European perspective. We're talking now, I mean, this is 1095 when the first Crusade is called for by the Pope. So in that period, what is the attitude and beliefs and inspiration of Europeans?
Right. And again, because I think one of the problems when talking about the Crusades is there's this deliberate vacuum, not by you, but by a lot of academics and scholars. I think it's best to actually offer a quick recap for those who are not aware of what we discussed in depth. So basically what the key points to keep in mind is what we call today the Islamic world, especially the heart of it, North Africa, the Middle East, or as it's known, MENA, okay, Middle East, North Africa. That was essentially the heart of the Christian world. So it wasn't Europe. Europe was also Christian, but Europe was almost, you want to call it the little brother, the newcomer Christian. And in fact, everything northeast of the Danube and Rhine was still pagan, including Scandinavia. So that's the context when Islam comes onto the scene, and this is now Christendom, and it's been Christian for centuries. It's been Christianizing since the time of Christ and the apostles, but then of course it becomes formalized with Constantine in the early 4th century, and now so by the time Muhammad comes on the picture, this is the Christian world. And he's in Arabia. So, there's this systematic conquest of the Christian West, which is, like I mean, Middle East, which is all the countries that you can think of today, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, the Palestinian, Jordan, Iraq. Persia, too, was conquered, and that was its own empire, the Zoroastrian Empire. And then all the way north from Egypt to Morocco, all again very Christian, heavily Christian regions, all conquered in the 7th century. And then Islam is in Spain in 711, early 8th century, and it's in the middle of France in 732, Battle of Tours. And this is now 1 century after Muhammad's death. So that's a massive change that took place to the globe, really, to the face of the old world.
I'll say one point on the, so it didn't make it yet to Britain. That there were Muslim conquerors of parts of England later, but in 732, Bede, in his ecclesiastical histories of England, was writing about the Saracens. So it was in the English imagination that early, even before England existed.
Right. And he does. I actually quote him a fair bit in Sword and Scimitar in the context of the Battle of Tours, because and it has a prophetic sort of apocalyptic version, how he sees it as a monk, the role of Islam, which is itself a very fascinating topic, how Christians actually perceived the rise of Islam, and what it meant to them, which has a lot to do with theodicy and God's justice. But anyway, we can maybe look at that later. So the point is, 7th century, Christendom has been split asunder. And now you have Europe by itself. This is what historians used to call the ushering in of the Dark Ages, which is now a term that many don't like to use for various reasons. But if you look at the work, the pioneering work, which has kind of been suppressed, of Henry Perrin, a French historian, great historian, and especially his seminal work, which is called Muhammad and Charlemagne. And his whole point is that Islam actually led to the rise of the Middle Ages and feudalism, because it completely disrupted trade, which was ongoing between Europe and North Africa and the Middle East, because they were one civilization. They were all Christians. It was Christendom. And so so even the rise of, the knight culture and the whole structure of, feudalism, as I mentioned, and the Frankish Empire, that's why the book is called, or his famous line, Perrin, is one of his sentences, is without Muhammad, there's no Charlemagne. So in other words, there was a direct line between these Islamic conquests and what happened to Europe. Okay. So now that's the context. And if you look at the sources, this was a traumatic event. The problem is, a lot of historians who may tell you this will act like they'll give you this most hygienic kind of neutral rendering, and they'll even cite later Arabic sources, which are essentially hagiographies of Islam, and it makes it basically look like, all the conquered people were begging for the Muslims to come liberate them from this or that other oppressor. Okay, and unfortunately, too many Western historians go along with that as well for political reasons. But if you look at the sources, this was a dramatic, cataclysmic time. I was recently reading a writing that is supposed to come out in 690. This is really, I thought, most of the conquests have taken place, but now, Spain hasn't been conquered yet. Most of North Africa has, but the western part still hasn't. And it's known as Pseudo-Methodius. And it's a very interesting book, and because it actually underscored how Christians after him saw the rise of Islam, and they actually believed that. But it's interesting because it tells you what happened and how they attacked, and it was the way they're presented is, it's not just that they're violent attackers, they're a scourge from God because of Western man or Christian men's many sins. And he even lists cross-dressing. Okay, so a lot of them are sexual immoralities. And that actually is important because this governs how Christians for centuries, this book actually, as late as 1683, when Vienna was being besieged, they were printing copies of it to make sense of the Islamic attack on Vienna. So that's how influential it is.
Inward looking as if it was punishment from God. Right,
exactly.
Right, okay.
And that really colored the way Christians saw this for the longest time. Now, so that's the backdrop. And Europe...
But just on the backdrop, though, on the fear, which you, or rather, was it fear? Was there a sense that this was a superior military force? Were they conscious at all about? I mean, we talk about, let's say, Bede or 732 Tours coming up, the Muslim conquest going that far north into France. Did they have a sense that of what Islam was, or was it just a tribe from the southern or from the east?
Yeah, no. That early in the 8th century, Christians do not understand in any way that this is a new religion. I mean, actually, we do have early sources from people like John of Damascus, who's actually writing in the late 600s. Okay, so just a few decades after Muhammad, but he's living there in I think in Syria. So he's very close to it, and he does understand this is a religion, but of course it's seen as a false religion and a false a prophet, who are and tied to biblical prophecy as an antichrist figure. But in Europe, by and large, the people of the 7th, 8th, and 9th centuries just saw destruction. They just saw these Saracens, as they called them, coming to destroy and annihilate. However, what's interesting is they also, the Muslim, and this is what kind of underscores that there is a religious element to it. They always went out of their way, even in tours and this and that, to denigrate and attack Christian symbolism. So they would attack churches, they would break crosses, they would, engage in all sorts of things. So Freinus, one of the earliest writers about the earliest attack, right around 634, this is right at the beginning of the Islamic conquests in the Holy Land, and he was the patriarch. He also talks about how they would, he has this long sermon about why are they doing this? Why are they attacking the cross? Why do they spit on our holy images? So there is, they sensed a religious hostility. They didn't understand this is Islam. There's a prophet named Muhammad, this and that early, except for other guys like John of Damascus and others. But in the West, it was definitely just seen as these are just marauders, savages come to destroy with a special dislike for our Lord Jesus.
So sorry, just then on the Muslim invaders, there's a fantastic episode actually on the Battle of Tours on The Rest is History with Tom Holland and Dominic Sandbrook, and they debate the question whether the invaders themselves were religiously motivated or whether it was all about loot and power and conquest, and it was maybe some sort of radical young men, but not necessarily religiously motivated. What's your answer to that?
That's a great question, and it really goes to the heart of a lot of things, including up until now with modern day terrorists and Muslims. Are they even religiously motivated, or is it something else? And so, in that context, actually, there's a good reason to say a lot of them weren't, and the reason they weren't religiously motivated, because a huge part of that army that invaded through Spain and went through the Pyrenees and entered into the ones who fought Charles Martel were Berbers.
Martel was the leader of
Charles Martel
in Tours
of the Franks. He's the one who led the Frankish army at the Battle of Tours, October 10, 732. And so the Berbers were recently converted to Islam from North Africa. They're the people who live around from, Libya, Algeria, Morocco. And actually, during their conquest, it's very interesting because the Muslims would fight them, and they were pretty rebellious, and they had this woman warlord, or the Kahina. She was this chieftain who was like very legendary, and they put up a staunch resistance for many years, and they would do this thing where they would convert finally, and then the Muslims would leave, and then it would just be a fake conversion, and they'd go back to their ways, and then they'd come attack them again. Anyway, by the time of Tours, now they've been converted, okay, but it's very clear that it's skin deep, and that at least the army, a lot of them are just in it. Okay, we've converted nominally. We're on your team. We're Muslims, and now fine. Now all we want is the green light to go attack, kill, and steal stuff. Okay,
right. Okay,
and so there's definitely a lot of room for that, especially in that battle, and especially in the context of the Berbers. Because this is a different group than what we were talking about earlier, which were the true Arabs from Arabia.
Yes,
there's still, of course, the core leadership is Arabs. From the Umayyad caliphates at that point, later in that time. But the Arabic sources do show and do speak about it, the historical texts, in a religious, as a jihad. Okay. But I'm just saying, on the one hand, of course, the texts can be, like I said, somewhat hagiographical and put a religious veneer on it. But the reality is, all of the jihads, no matter what, were very much motivated by plunder. It was ultimately just war and conquest and enslavement and the rest of it. So you can't do, and that's, I think, that's the appeal of it, because they're inseparable, and Allah doesn't care if you're right with Him in your heart. As long as you go fight and win, you're good. You see what I mean?
Right. Okay.
It's a very different idea, and that's why I say even we can apply this to today, because oftentimes I see the people Muslims, the radicals who talk about jihad and so forth, they're really motivated by other things, whether it's, raping women or enslaving women, things like that. But the religious element validates it. Right. So it makes them the good guys. So I think what I'm trying to say is that the creed of Islam is such that a lot of people men who gravitated to it were people who are just maybe unsavory sorts, but it justified and gave a pious veneer to the sorts of things that we're going to do anyway.
Most men begin losing testosterone around age 30, bit by bit every year. And here's the kicker. Even when your body is producing it, a lot of it gets bound up by something called SHBG. It's like having money in the bank, but your card doesn't work. That's where Mars Men comes in. It's designed to help free up usable testosterone. No synthetics, no needles, just 8 natural, clinically dosed ingredients like Tongat Ali, Shilajit, vitamin D, zinc, boron, and more. You will have steadier energy, better recovery, more consistency in the gym. You'll feel sharper and more driven again. It supports healthy T levels, energy, stamina, and it's made in the USA. Third-party tested with a 90-day money-back guarantee, so there's really no risk in trying it. For a limited time, our listeners get 50% off for life, plus free shipping and 3 free gifts at mengotomars.com. Perfect way to kick off the new year strong. That's mengotomars.com for 50% off and 3 free gifts at checkout. After you purchase, they will ask you where you heard about them. Please support our work and tell them our show sent you. Again, that's mengotomars.com, 50% off for life, free shipping, and 3 free gifts. Back to then the Frankish and the Europeans.
Right.
There's an argument made by Theodore Roosevelt, your former president from a long time ago, and who was also a historian, and he argued that had the Christians not engaged in just war then, all of Europe and indeed America might well be Muslim. So I'd like to get into the theology and thoughts and process, the thought process of the Europeans then. Obviously, there's a long time between that and the First Crusade. Right. So I'm sure it's gradual. Right. There's also the concept of just war, which has actually been well established by St. Augustine a few hundred years before that. Right. I don't know how best to approach this this development, this theological development in the mind of Western Europeans. But perhaps the question would be, from Tours to the First Crusade, at what point do they start saying, actually, the issue is Islam rather than just defending their own lands, and we're going to go all the way to what we now call the Middle East to defend it or defeat it?
Where I left off was just basically telling you the 7th century conquest of North Africa and the Middle East and into Spain and the Battle of Tours. This is all the Arabs, okay? The Arab, especially the righteous caliphs, as it's called, the second one, Omar, and after him, and then the Umayyad Caliphate. Okay, this is where the great Arab conquests take place. Now, the pivotal event between that and the rise of the First Crusade is that a new actor enters the stage and takes over the mantle of Islam. In fact, the mantle of Jihad, and that would be the Turks. So the Turks started being imported. The Abbasid Caliphate, especially, which was centered in Baghdad, which succeeded the Umayyads, started to import Turks as slave soldiers, which is a very common practice in Islam, and they also would do it later to Europeans, like the Janissaries. But so they would bring them in droves, and because they were great fighters.
At this point, the Turks were even further east.
Yeah, they're not in Turkey
Asia Minor.
No. Asia Minor now is still Christian.
Yeah,
still part of the Byzantine or Eastern Roman Empire.
So they would be.
I'm talking now 9th century is when they're being brought in. Yeah. And turned into fighters. Okay, slave soldiers, because they were great warriors. And they're Islamized. And then before long, as usual happens, these slaves turn on their masters and take over. Yeah. And especially in the context of the rise of the Seljuk Empire. So the Seljuks, that's just the tribal name of one of their founder. And right around, this is now the 11th. So now we're talking about maybe 70 years before the First Crusade is when the Seljuks are really starting to grow in power. Now what they did is essentially created it was deja vu. It was a reminiscence of what happened in the 7th century, the conquest, but now it began anew, and now it was in Asia Minor, especially. So, and the thing is, because it's closer to us in time, and this is just a normal aspect of history, things that are close to us in time and space, we have more records. So we have more records of what actually these Turks did than what the Arabs did from centuries earlier. And it is some graphic stuff, okay? This is contemporary stuff written by people living at the time. Whoever wants to look into it, one of them would be Matthew of Edessa. This is an Armenian. So now, now think of the Asia Minor, or Anatolia, Turkey today. Armenia was much larger at the time. It was Greater Armenia. It was essentially the eastern portion of Turkey, and Georgia as well. And if you look at the sources, these Turks ran in, running amok, killing and slaughtering tens of thousands of Armenian Christians, and also Greeks, because the western portion of Anatolia is primarily Greek, and destroying churches. And again, it's very obvious that they have the jihadist animus for Christianity. They capture a cross and they send it to Baghdad as a trophy. They drag it in the dirt. They chop the heads off of statues of Mary, things that are actually happening today as well. And one city, the capital.
Today in Europe, by the way.
Yeah.
That happened in Brussels over Christmas.
Yeah. That happens all the time. I know they actually reported that one, but this every year, because I follow what happens numerous during Christmas, and even not Christmas, Christians crosses and statues are defecated on, and the altar is smeared with urine and all kinds of graphic stuff, which happened back then too. So the continuity is staggering. But anyway, so these Turks are just running amok and slaughtering. Ani was the capital of Armenia. It was known as a city of 1,001 churches. Each and every one of them was pillaged, plundered, and burned to the ground. Okay. So when you talk about the Armenian genocide of the early 20th century, it actually really began a millennium before that, because what I'm talking about is exactly 1,000 years earlier. Now that's going on, and at the same time that's happening, pilgrims from Europe had always been going to the Holy Land, okay? And, depending on the Muslim governor, or, they would have a deal. For example, Charlemagne had a deal with Harun al-Rashid, and basically it was peaceful. They can come and do their pilgrimage to the holy sites, but they had to, of course, pay. And even then, they would get attacked, of course, because the mob would rise up for whatever reason. But with the Seljuks, during this time that I'm telling you, it got really bad for European travelers. Okay, they were constantly being attacked. They would force more money out of them, and when they'd get the money, they'd kick them out and say, you still can't go pilgrimage. And the worst one happened in 1064. It's widely documented. And it was a German pilgrimage that came. They described a head nun, an abbess was there, who was of comely appearance. And they told her, don't go, it's dangerous. And lo and behold, they slaughtered everyone, the Turks, and gang raped her. And they raped her to death, essentially. And then the chronicler writes, and they did this often to everyone. Okay, so that is this is the First Crusade. Now we've reached...
Is it a reliable source, you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Okay. Yeah.
And so this news, is it getting all the way to Western Europe?
Yeah. It's getting, okay, so first, the emperor of the Eastern Roman Empire, the Byzantine Emperor, Alexius, he is dealing with these Turkic attacks on Asia Minor, okay, and now they're very close to him in Constantinople, and he calls for aid. He's actually the main reason. But also European pilgrims from Europe directly who are going and pilgrimage are suffering, and reports are reaching Europe as well. So it's those two things. And so that's the backdrop of the First Crusade. It was just more of the usual, but an even fiercer form under the Turks. And now, for whatever reason, it's funny because there were calls to crusades before the First Crusade. So one of the most, in 1009, so this is well over a century before the First Crusade. No, I'm sorry, it's not. It's under a century, okay? It's about 75, 80 years. The Egyptian Fatimid Caliph, Hakim Ba'amrullah, to prove his bona fides, because he was a Shia. Shias were actually ruling Egypt. Many people don't realize that. They don't realize Al-Azhar, this bastion of Sunni learning, was actually built and was a Shia madrasa in its origins. But he actually systematically, according to Muslim sources, destroyed 30,000 churches and synagogues in Egypt and Syria, which again shows you how Christian that area was. And he even destroyed the Holy Sepulchre, which is where every Christian went for pilgrimage, which was built upon where Jesus was believed to have resurrected.
And remind me what year that was.
1009.
1009, okay, yeah. Okay, gotcha.
And at that time, the Pope of the time tried to call for a crusade, even though they never had it. And there was a lot of anger and a lot of people wanted to, but nothing came of it.
Okay, so when the Sepulchre,
Yeah.
the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is destroyed, that's actually when the first crusade is called for.
No, that's when a pope tried to call for something like a crusade, but it didn't come to pass.
And before then, though, was there not an idea of crusades against pagans? Is that again? Am I going to? Because later there were crusades against pagans in the north in Finland.
Yeah,
but earlier, when let's say King Alfred was fighting the Great Heathen Army, was that conceptualized the same way, or is that a separate thing?
No. The crusade idea it begins against Islam and then later morphs against pagan peoples.
Okay.
But in its origins, it's not with King Alfred. There are again hints of it in the 8th and 9th centuries. For example, when Rome was attacked by Saracen pirates in I want to say something like 850-ish. Okay. Several popes would basically, the whole thing about the Crusades is, the indulgence, that if you commit and you fight and you die, okay, it's not that you go to heaven. The way many people also don't understand the whole indulgence business. It's not like it's basically, it was tied up to the idea of purgatory. Okay, so you're saved because you were baptized and you were washed by Christ. But because you sin, the purgatory idea is there, so you have to suffer through purgatory. Going in the Crusades, what that did is it would alleviate the sufferings, because now you're doing good, so that should take away from the time that you're going to suffer in purgatory. That's all it was, because a lot of people have a misunderstanding, thinking it's kind of like, oh, if you go and fight, you go to heaven. It wasn't that. It was more about lessening the sufferings of purgatory, which is kind of a Catholic idea. Okay,
so they tied it into. That was coming from the Pope himself.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what the indulgences were, which I think, in other words, they're not as bad as what people think it is. But a lot of people think it was just kind of like, hey, go fight, and if you die, you're going to heaven.
Okay, so it's worth touching on the theology here then a little bit, because this is really, seems to me, radically different from the teachings of Christ. So to have a pope going to that length, and it's also radically different from where we are today, and the church calling for any such thing. Christ, if you look at his actions and behavior through the Gospels, it is so, there is no violence.
Except for that thing in the temple and the whip.
Which humans did he hurt in that? Well, he threw up some tables.
But it says he drove out the animals and the humans.
Driving out.
Yeah, okay. But it's an act of violence. It's not. I mean, this isn't passive.
Well, how are you defining violence then?
Making a whip, throwing things over, and it sounds like he's whipping animals and humans out of a temple. That sounds kind of violent. It's not exactly passive.
If that's the take,
I'm going with you.
Let me.
I'm not trying to. I'm going in the spirit that you're going with, but I'm saying there is that.
Well, there's also the famous case when he's in the Garden of Gethsemane and Simon Peter smites one of the people coming to take him away, and Jesus says, "Live by the sword, die by the sword," and heals the person who's had his ear lobbed off. So. Jesus' message is one of peace, and is his whole mission, life. It's healing, or his whole mission, time mission.
No, this is a great topic.
So it is drastically different. The famous piece of scripture that is brought up is when Jesus says, "I've come." It's in Matthew,
I bring a sword.
I bring by the sword. And it's also the case that. He said, I came here to divide. He doesn't say, he's not as a softy and a hippy dippy in any way. If you actually, but nevertheless, apart from your one case that he might have been violent at the temple, there is no. He's a peace. It's the opposite of violence. Okay. It seems to me.
Okay.
But do you contend that?
No, it's not that I contend it. It's just there's still a lot to unpack about that. And there's the implicit things that aren't said, that Jesus didn't say, that actually formed just war theory. So maybe we should talk about that.
Well, we should talk about that, right? Because so just war theory comes up with St. Augustine.
It came before him, but he's credited it with it because he really formalizes it and kind of summarizes it in a good way. And it always goes back to, so let's stay with Jesus and what he said and did. So when Jesus, so for example, and what I'm telling you is the arguments that Augustine himself made. I'm just, summarizing. So basically he would say things like, When someone comes to Jesus for help or aid or miracle, and Jesus obliges them, it almost always ends up with go repent, stop doing what you're doing, right? There's a call to change your life because what they were doing is evil, whether it's adultery or, I don't know, being a tax collector or whatever. So then this Roman centurion comes to Jesus, okay? And to know what a Roman centurion is, that's basically a man who's got his hands dipped in blood, okay? To be a Roman soldier, you've killed.
Mm-hmm.
To be a Roman centurion, okay, in charge of 100 men, yeah, you've been responsible for a lot of bloodshed and a lot of death.
Mm-hmm.
This man comes to Jesus and he wants a miracle for his servant. Jesus obliges, okay? And then and Jesus has nothing to say about this man but good stuff. He says, I haven't found a man in all of Israel with as much faith as this man, because he said, because the centurion told Jesus, you don't have to come with me. If you say he'll be healed, he'll be healed. Okay. But no, you would think that Jesus, who tells the prostitute to repent and who tells every sinner to repent, you would think the least he would do is tell this centurion, you need to stop killing people.
But I think he does.
No.
He doesn't?
No, he doesn't say anything like that.
I wish I had a Bible here to...
No, you're talking about the liberal Bibles.
I'm talking about the King
that
James.
proliferate in the UK. I'm talking about the real Bible. So, no, he doesn't have a single word bad about him. Now, this is what I mean by it's an implicit justification for just war that Augustine and others cite. Because why is Jesus not telling this man, look at what you're doing? You're a horrible person. You're killing. You gotta, put the sword away. He who kills by the sword and die. Okay. And then there's other men who come to John the Baptist. They're soldiers too. And they say, what must we do to repent? So, they've killed people too. They're soldiers. And he tells them to be content with their wages and do not unjustly kill someone. Okay. Again, makes it very clear that there's room for what we call just war theory, which is basically war in defense or in reclamation of stolen possessions or to defend the innocent. Okay. Those are just two examples, but there's many more. So you have that, but now you have another one. Another verse that Jesus said. He said, okay, and this is a very interesting one. This actually ties to my book. It's the title of my book. So one of the verses in Luke, Jesus, he tells his disciples that, and now, whoever doesn't have a sword, sell your cloak and buy one. And the disciples look around and they say, Lord, look, here's 2 swords. And then Jesus says, oh, that's enough. Okay. Now today, to modern day Christians, what does that mean? Absolutely nothing. It's just, I don't know, mumbo jumbo. It means nothing because it can't mean swords. All right. It actually meant something very more literal to earlier Christians, especially medieval and especially Crusaders.
So this is the title of your book now.
The title of my book is The Two Swords of Christ.
Okay. Right.
And so how medieval Christians understood it was that there's 2 swords, that we as Christians have to be armed with 2 swords. One, to fight spiritual evils, which I think modern day Christians will still accede to, agree with. And one, to fight secular human agents, evil. Okay, so a secular sword to fight and a spiritual sword. That's how it was understood. Okay, and again, the secular sword is used in a just war concept, not go conquer and kill and force people to be Christians. Okay, and so to my book, The Two Swords of Christ, I call it that in a way because it's about the military orders, and they often would cite that verse. And also as a pun, I ended up writing about the 2 main ones, which is the Templars and the Hospitallers. So in a way, right, they were the 2 swords of Christ. And if you see the cover, the pommels on each of the 2 swords represents one of the others, one of the 2. Anyway, so you definitely have, and this is, I've told you all these verses, okay, and there's more. And then there's the whole Old Testament, which you have to bear in mind for medieval Christians was very real. They saw themselves as the successors of the Hebrews of the Bible. And the Old Testament's full of violence. The Old Testament is full of God calling for violence, okay? And so they also imbibed that tradition in themselves, okay? So I think all of that, the Augustinian concept of just war, the 2 swords of Christ logic, which was pretty prevalent at the time, and, the centurion and all these different examples, the Old Testament and its tenor all throughout, and then, of course, what Muslims are doing at this time.
And Augustine was writing at the time that the Western Empire was under attack from barbarians, and there was the fall of the Western Empire to barbarians in 476 AD. There was a sense of if we don't defend ourselves,
right.
And that's enough. This was long before Islam.
Yeah.
If we don't defend ourselves, actually,
that's what happens.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
And then and then there's a human element, like between you and me when we talk about it. This idea of ultimate pacifism, it's just kind of hard to understand if you take it to this logical conclusion. Okay? Imagine, okay, so Jesus is with us in a room, and a horde of barbarians burst in and start raping and mutilating women and children. Is Jesus going to be like, don't do anything? Don't hurt those guys, but it's okay for the women and children to be hurt? Like, why? What's the logic in that?
Well, we never have an example like that. We have the example of Jesus commanding us to turn the other cheek.
Right.
And there's a wisdom to that.
But that's not a personal thing. You can't have a society like that. That's my point.
And it would be a sin if someone tries to rape your daughter. It's a sin not to do something about it.
But my point is, I don't think Jesus is saying create a constitution based on, the Sermon on the Mount. Because if you do that, you're going to be run down. People are going to take advantage of you, and they're going to exploit you, and they're going to run you down. Okay, is that the ultimate message of the gospel? And again, I'm not preaching or saying that Christians need to be militant. I'm just saying the bare minimum is to be, Jesus said, be as innocent as doves, but as wise as serpents. Okay. And Christians are called to be wise and prudent, and it doesn't, so to take all these, let's say, policies or actions and just think your job is to lay down, and I call them doormat Christians, and have everyone walk over you and think somehow that they're not going to do that. No, I mean, left to its logical conclusion, if Christianity does not defend itself, just like that quote from Teddy Roosevelt, which is absolutely right, and I quote in sort of scimitar somewhere, and I have a paraphrase where he says, if Christians did not know how to fight and parallel and eventually overcome the Muslims, and he talks about basically from the 7th century to the 1700s, he's like, Christianity would have been snuffed out, because it was snuffed out in other areas where Islam took over, which is the Muslim world. Okay. Europe could have been like what the Copts of Egypt and the Assyrians in Iraq and Syria are experiencing. Is that the ultimate vision, for Christ, that Christians must always be attacked and abused and mauled and raped? And, again, it's one thing to say, Christianity is not about going on the offensive, which I'm for that. But to just say that we have to go out of our way, okay, I've actually been looking into this very deeply, this question, and I actually have something important to share with you. This is a philosophical take on why people today, including you and me possibly, have a problem with violence and how it seems so unchristian to us. Shall I elaborate?
I'm all ears.
Okay. So I think what's going on today is that essentially modern Christians of today, despite what they think they know or what they believe, are ultimately governed by a materialist philosophy, just like atheists. By that I mean, okay, so what is materialist philosophy? It's the philosophy that says, I only believe and act upon and take into consideration that which is real, okay? This is real. You're real, okay? Don't give me... So we deal with physical reality, things that can be measured, seen, felt, quantified, and discussed, all right? Metaphysical, that word basically means that which is beyond the physical, which is everything else, which is ideas, morality, ethics, God himself. These are all metaphysical concepts. The atheist tends to reject them. And I get the logic, because his first premise is only that which I can see, feel, measure is real. So everything else falls by the wayside. Now, Christians...
And the atheist will try to build an ethic code on top of well-being. This is like a classic.
Right,
Sam Harris tried to do this.
Right. Okay, now the Christian supposedly believes in a host of metaphysical truisms, all right? And a lot of these truisms, so for example, I was looking recently at, for example, the 7 deadly sins, right? Pride and lust and envy and sloth and gluttony. And what else? I'm probably missing one. Anyway, and I'm looking at them and I'm thinking to myself, that was the heart of what Christians, these are metaphysical aspects. And this was the most important thing that Christians were worried about. And look, the 7 deadly sins, and what's not there is death and murder and killing, isn't?
Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? You know why? Because it's a byproduct of those sins. It's a byproduct of pride and envy and, greed and that sort of thing. So my point is, back then, in this era that we're talking about, they were governed by a metaphysical understanding, okay?
Yes.
They understood killing is bad, okay? Murder, Of course, I mean, it's in the Bible. Murder is bad. I'm never arguing that it's not. But to them, there was a whole host of other things that were even worse. So that killing actually was sometimes seen as the lesser of two evils. Okay, blasphemy against God or desecration of holy spaces or things that, and that's my point. So all these things that actuated those Christians to war don't make sense to modern Christians because they're materialists at heart. They don't understand, to them, the only parts of Christianity, which is why if you look at modern day Christians, they care about things like, violence is bad, killing, of course, stealing is bad. Why? Because it's physical. And what are the virtues? Oh, helping the poor, helping the needy. Again, money, it's physical. You're helping their material lots of these people. But you don't hear any more about moral sins or moral virtues. And that's because I believe modern day Christians, despite what they say or they claim to believe, have been sucked into the materialist worldview like the atheist. And so they prioritize the same sorts of things like violence. Physical violence is the ultimate evil. Okay. But it wasn't. So from a Christian point of view, physical violence is evil. But there's even greater evils that are metaphysical and abstract. Okay. And that's what those guys were fighting against. And if it meant we have to fight and kill, then so be it, because we had to guard the soul.
Yes.
You know, the sins that I'm talking about that are abstract, they were evil and they were bad because they affect and kill the soul, which is all that matters, because the body's going to die anyway. Part of just war theory, Augustine said that. He said, you were going to die anyway. So it's because you killed someone in a just cause. It's not exactly a big deal. Yeah. We're all dust anyway. It's the soul that matters. So that, I think, and today you look at our society, pride, well, the really envy sins, pride and envy and lust and gluttony and sloth. Those are, not only are they not frowned upon in our society, they are the heart of our economy. Okay.
Quite. And I think since the Great War and the Second World War, even honor and valor are no longer, which are metaphysical things. They
meant so much, those words. And today, what do they even mean?
Probably because of the physical trauma of those two wars.
That for sure. But I guess what I'll wrap it up.
I think you're onto something. If I might add something, I think part of the reason historians on the Crusades seem to do a bad job, it's always very difficult to find good histories of the Crusades because they actually can't even conceptualize what you're talking about.
They anachronize.
They anachronize, and it's quite often done in what the economic motivations, which I was going to ask you. Right. But what are the material motivations? Because they can't possibly be any other one.
Exactly.
When actually
they're
spiritual.
Marxists. Yeah. That's why, exactly. You're absolutely right. This is one of the problems in understanding the Crusades, because they see it from a Marxist, materialist lens. Okay. And, but I'm saying it's even worse because Christians see it that way too, which is why Christians poo-poo and condemn the Knights of the Temple and the Hospitaller, because on the one hand, these guys were pious monks crawling on their knees. Okay. Like literally think of a medieval monk. And then on the other hand, they're at war and they're just these valorous, fierce warriors. Okay. Which, to us it's what a complete contradiction, right? You're either a doormat monk who's on the, crying, or you're a fighter. You're not both. So they were a very interesting animal, this fusion, and very effective as well. But like I said, they were not materialists. So yeah, killing is bad. We're not going to kill someone unjustly, but there's so much worse that's going on that we need to fight on behalf of. Right. Morality. Okay, metaphysics, that which is beyond the physical, we have to protect. And that's why if we have to fight, and kill, then so be it. Modern day Christian, I don't think gets that because he is a materialist, which is to say he's an atheist at heart. I think too many Christians, they just throw out formulations, but when you see the way they live and the way they see the world, it's really indistinguishable from an atheistic worldview. And I think a lot of people know that deep down inside when they think about it. So anyway, I tell you all that in the context of just war, but also to help make sense of these Crusaders, especially, the Templars and the Hospitallers, the military orders. What's really, amazing about them is, like I said, really emphasizing, you had what's called a secular Crusader, which was a regular European knight or whatever who'd go and fight, who's obviously a Christian. But these guys were, very pious on the one hand and very violent on the other. And in my book, I actually talk about how this even then was seen as strange amongst some critics, but others actually thought it was like Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He was a champion for the Knights of the Military Orders, and it's very interesting stuff that, like you said, is just completely missed by most people.
We actually haven't even properly started with the Crusades themselves, okay. Which is what this conversation is supposed to be about. But there is one thing I wondered whether it was important to the worldview of Europeans at that point, was the Constantinople, which we touched on, and the Turks going increasingly west. But Constantinople, it's still the heart of Christendom, right? Yeah. At this point in time,
right? It's
still the most cosmopolitan. It's the center of the world. Right. Right? Would that be right?
Yeah.
That? So the idea of Turks coming closer to Constantinople, was that in a way a motivation, being like, actually, this is going too far, or have I?
No.
I'm sort of speculating here. But
you're definitely onto something. So first of all, in the Byzantine, that word was coined in the 1800s. Okay, so the people living in Constantinople called themselves Romans, and the Arabs and the Muslims called them the Romans. So these were the Romans, both to themselves and to their enemies. There's no Byzantine word. Okay, they were the successors, and they really were, of Rome. All that changed is that Constantine moved it from Rome to New Rome, as it was called, but it took his name on. It became Constantinople, and the administrative language changed from Latin to Greek. Okay,
right.
But it was still Christian, and it was still Rome in their eyes. So Muhammad.
But let's say the Franks and the English wouldn't have thought of themselves as Romans.
No. Well, that's the thing.
They'd have thought of themselves as Christians. Would they have thought these are our Christian brothers?
Yeah. Well, before the split, which I think is in the 11th century, okay, or right around the First Crusade, actually not so far. But to the layman, these splits never made sense. I mean, these were always,
This is the split with the Orthodox
and the Catholic,
which is about 1050.
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah. Okay.
And which is actually a few decades before the First Crusade. So before that, it was all really one church, more or less. The Eastern Constantinople Orthodox and the Catholics. There was really no split at that point. So, but at the same time, Rome, after it being completely annihilated, you have the pivotal event in the year 800, which is when the Roman Pope crowns Charlemagne as the first Holy Roman Emperor. Mm-hmm. Okay, so that brings Rome, old Rome, as Catholic Rome, back into play. And it works with Constantinople, but there's, of course, a little envy and power struggle between the two as well. But not, as you can see, not with the First Crusade, because the First Crusade was all about helping Constantinople. So, yeah, Constantinople was seen, especially, so Muhammad himself in a canonical hadith wanted Constantinople, but of course he calls it Rome. Whichever Muslim conquers Rome, by which he meant Constantinople, would get the greatest rewards in paradise. Because it was such an important goal. Okay, for Muslims.
Would he meant the city itself, not the empire, or not? Sort of.
He probably meant the city itself, which would have been the empire. In his way of thinking from Arabia. I mean, it's known as Rome over there, but it's really big.
Yes.
Because it encompasses a lot of territories.
They don't capture it until 1453,
right?
Which is a long way away in our history. We should actually get to the beginning of the Crusades.
Let's start this, by the way.
I think it's a pretty good preface.
Prelude, yeah.
So take me to 1095. I know your book's about the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller, but that is actually a bit later.
Yeah, they come after the First Crusade. Yeah.
Let's go to the First Crusade. Sorry, we did talk about this a little bit in our last conversation, but it's worth recapping then. So we've got a sense of the worldview of these knights and warriors and fighters, and this is the People's Crusade first and foremost, right?
Well, yeah. So Pope Urban in 1095 in Clermont calls for what became the First Crusade. And, it's supposed to be one of these big conundrums in history because, like I told you, there were calls for earlier Crusades, including when they destroyed the Holy Sepulchre in 1009, and they never materialized. This one, for whatever reason, just snowballed all of Europe. That, in fact, that more than they even wanted started going on crusading. Okay.
Okay.
And the first ones were the peasants. the peasant crusades, who just were, a bunch of rabble who, it would have been better for them to just stay home because they engage in all sorts of atrocities. This is when the Jews, of course, get attacked along the Rhine. And
Which
then
is a terrible pogrom, by the way.
Yeah.
Tens of sort of 12,000 Jews killed.
Probably. The numbers are, they're pretty big. And, but again, they did it, of course, those Christians, but it was not sanctioned. It was not, in other words, they would get excommunicated because of that. They would be condemned by the church authorities.
Okay.
And
so
in
why
fact,
why do they think that the Jews should be fought as well? Is this anyone who's not a Christian?
What happened is a lot of these peasant crusaders were sort of motivated by millenarianism, which was rife at the time. Okay?
Which is?
It's this idea that Jesus is coming. It's the end of the world, because it's almost it's the year 1000. It's the 11th century, and before that also
nearly the year 1100.
Well, yeah, but before that there was a lot of that kind of movement going on, and a lot of these guys were almost like portrayed themselves as prophets, but the whole point was, okay, so we're marching all the way to fight. Muslim, Jew, to them, same thing. They're Christ deniers.
Okay, so they did think, Christ deniers. So they put them in the same category.
Yeah. And the logic would be kind of like, why are we marching and killing ourselves for thousands of miles when here they are amongst us? Okay,
right.
Which was not, of course, the purpose of the crusade, and that's why they were attacked and excommunicated. And oftentimes the people who protected them were the church. The Jews would run to church authorities, who would actually help and protect them. So it was a bad move, obviously, and they were condemned for it. And a lot of it, I think, was just rapacity, trying to just take the money and like an easy target.
Okay, so they had material objectives as well. It's not solely spiritual.
Yeah. And and they reached and they got their just desserts in a way, because the peasant crusaders were the first to set off. They did that. It was mostly under one guy. I forget his name, who was like a real rabble rouser. And anyway, and then they go into the heart of the Islamic world before everyone else, and they come annihilated. Okay, just completely annihilated, because they're just rabble. Okay, they had no knights, no military order. There's just a bunch of wild, crazy people running around with pitchforks attacking. These were these were the lowest of the low IQ types. Okay, they were enthusiastic. This is kind of like
captured by a religious fever.
Captured by religious fervor.
And they were like, they're going to give up their lives.
Right.
Were their lives good?
Well, no.
Pretty awful,
peasants.
I imagine.
Yeah, they're peasants.
So
exactly.
They're like, F this.
Yeah, F this, I'm traveling, and then, look at this rich, comfortable Jew, and then they rile each other up about it, and, they're the Christ killers too, and then, before you know it, you get a pogrom.
Okay.
And,
so they march across Europe. This takes presumably a few months.
Yeah, they're the first to set off the Peasant Crusade, the People's Crusade, as it's called. And they're the first to go, and all they do is chaos, and then they meet
the Turks in Asia Minor, right?
Yeah,
on the other side of Constantinople.
Right.
Okay.
And once they get there, they just get annihilated. So it's almost like a just dessert type thing.
So they don't get much further than that.
No, they make no progress or no gains or anything. They just get killed.
Okay, this is 1095, right? So,
yeah. Well, it's probably now early 1096.
1096.
Yeah.
But so this isn't the first crusade as historians call it. The historians.
This is it's a part of it. The first crusade was mass movements that went in different waves. This is the first one.
Okay.
And this was the worst one, and it was the most ineffective one. Okay. It was just the one that, like we said, it did not accomplish any goals, and it just created havoc and killed Jews.
Okay. And then, so is the next one a more solid? What happens next?
The next one.
Did the Europeans learn about the quote unquote People's Crusade? What's the story that gets home?
So you have the People's Crusades, who are peasants. Then you have the nobles and the knights. Okay, they take their time preparing, because they know this is war, and they know war requires logistics and supplies. And that's the whole difference between the peasants. They just religious fervor, and they run out with pitchforks, and after they get tired, realize, oh boy, we're not even a tenth of the way there. Well, let's just get them. Right. Okay, so these guys, they basically wash their hands of the peasant crusaders. They have nothing to do with them. Okay, right. These are professional warriors. These are knights, and they're men at arms and so forth. So various ones of them raise large armies, and it's very interesting because it goes against what a lot of modern historians will tell you. For the longest time, I think it's Sir Stephen Runciman, who wrote, I think, a 3-volume well-loved history of the
Which I
Crusades.
read in between our two conversations.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
You were probably then familiar with the term second sons, which is his way of saying that a lot of the men who went on crusading were second sons who did not have any inheritance because of primogeniture. And so their idea was, I'm going to go to this foreign land and carve my own kingdom.
Again,
right.
Material.
Yeah,
ambition.
exactly.
So it wasn't just spiritual.
Exactly.
It was a combination.
Well, it's material in the eyes of Runciman because he's a materialist.
Right.
But what I'm saying is when you look at the sources, actually that's been disproven. And other historians have said, no, that is not the consideration because the vast majority of them actually were landed and gave up everything and sold and gave away, the
vast
wealth.
Majority.
Yeah. Yeah. The Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse. And there's others in my book. You can see them. And they weren't necessarily, and some were second sons, some were third, some were first. But they were always, it wasn't about material considerations, even though that's become such an ironclad idea in our mind. But a lot of, more academic historians have done a lot of groundwork to show that that idea is just completely wrong based on the sources that I'm telling you. I'm just giving you a summary, okay, that was not really a consideration. And think about it. People really forget how hard what these Crusaders were doing. You're traversing all of Europe. Most of them are coming, let's say, from Francia or France, and you're traveling thousands of miles on foot. Okay, and to get to this
with armor, weapons,
and you're going into enemy territory. And if it was about just conquering a piece of land, there's easier ways to do it than that.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
The whole pagan North could still be conquered and even justified and say, you're pagans. That's not what they were doing at that time. They were doing this. So
but there were some of them who were good at it, right? So we're talking about this period of the Normans, and the Normans were successfully conquering around.
They were in Sicily. They actually had conquered it from Arabs and Muslims. The Normans definitely played a major role in the Crusades.
When did they conquer Sicily from the Arabs?
I want to say it was actually relatively early, like not long before the Crusades. Maybe in the 11th century. I think the early or mid 11th century.
Would that have been considered a crusade? Not really.
They didn't. Term had still, or that concept had still not solidified.
Right. Okay.
It was, it's in the air.
Not the word crusade, but was it like recapturing it for Christendom? Is more.
Yeah, it was. Of course, it was seen as a reclamation for Christendom from the Saracens. But I mean, the whole panoply of theological justification and all that may not have coalesced at that point yet. Okay, that really starts with the First Crusade and it continues actually codifying with subsequent crusades. Okay, but where were we?
Okay, so you've got this army that going all the way to. You've had the Disastrous People's Crusade, and you've got the actual warriors, the professionals coming along. You've painted despite having painted actually the worldview of these people. There's if I were to ask them, one of those Crusaders, the warrior ones, for the sort of elevator pitch for why, obviously they wouldn't know what an elevator is, but what is the kind of brief reason why? Is it to reconquer the Holy Land from the Muslims? Is that what they would have said?
It would have been, there were two chief reasons. The chief reason was because, and this is another idea that's hard for us to understand, Holy Land, holy places, sacred sites, okay? The Holy Land where, Jesus and the apostles and the patriarchs of the Old Testament, that whole area is so important. To modern day Christians, they don't get that. God is everywhere. Jesus is in me. I don't know. Who cares? Okay, that's that was completely alien at that time. At that time, it was not unlike Jews and Muslims today who are, fanatical about the Holy Land. Christians were just as well. And so you had unbelievers, Muslims, who were desecrating the Holy Land where Christ walked and he was incarnated, where God was incarnated and resurrected. And I'm giving you the way they would talk. And now it's being all this sacrilege is happening at the hands of these unbelievers. And on top of it, they're killing Christians and they're preventing them from pilgrimage. So that was the chief reason, was now it's time we need to go and take charge of matters. And the second one was to help fellow Christians. And so in a way, the one verse in the Bible that says, where Jesus says, the two greatest commandments is to love God with all your heart and then love your fellow man. That's in their mind what they were doing, because loving God was to go and protect his sanctity in the Holy Land, which was being desecrated. And loving your fellow man was to go help the fellow Christians who were being also attacked.
Right. They were loving their brethren.
Right.
Their
So
brothers.
it was actually seen like a great act of love, despite how it's seen now today as a cynical move to go for second sons to go and carve out a kingdom.
Right. Okay. So this second batch of warriors, they make it.
They do make it
to the Holy Land.
Yeah.
And how does that go?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's very dramatic when you look at the sources, and I get into in Defenders of the West, Chapter 1. I really focus on that, and just getting there, and this is an important point. When at some point you should ask me, so remind me, so are the Crusades glorious or not? Because I'd like to, because a lot of people like to tell you, the Crusades are a big failure, and yeah, they are in the end, but you miss the real point, and I'll get into that. But so they cross and they go through hell. Okay, I mean the sufferings they go through before they even start fighting. Okay, starvation, sickness, plague. Okay, and everyone around them is an enemy. Nobody's helping them because they just threw themselves into the lion's den. Okay, and there's few Christians, but miracle of miracles, as it was seen, they prevail. First, they conquer Edessa, and then Antioch, which was this was probably the most prolonged and kind of epic siege of the whole First Crusade.
Right.
It took like well over a year, and a very, very dramatic story. And then finally, it culminates with the conquest of Jerusalem, I think around July 15, 1099. Okay. So those Crusaders, the real professional Crusaders, really start their trek in 1097, and by 1099 it's accomplished. Okay, those 2 years, those 2 brutal years. Okay, and they went and they accomplished what they set out to do. They carve a kingdom, Christendom, a little Christendom, Outremer as it was known.
Out what?
Outremer.
Outremer.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
It means the Christian kingdom on the other side of the ocean, basically.
Okay.
And it was so, like I said, it was principalities and territories, in the kingdom of Jerusalem was the heart of it, and that's it. They hold on to it. They lose piece by piecemeal. They lose Jerusalem in 1187. So under a century.
You're jumping ahead.
Yeah. Okay.
Do we have a sense of how many were killed? Not just of the Crusaders, but of those who were in the Holy Land that they were attacking.
Yeah. The numbers. So first of all, again, the numbers is always an issue because the primary sources say one thing, and then modern scholars will tell you, no, it can't be that. But the numbers, according to the sources, are literally hundreds of thousands. But this would include women and children. Okay.
So they were slaughtering Muslim women and children.
No, women and European women and children would go on the First Crusade.
They went with them.
Yeah.
Because the intention was to stay there.
Yeah.
And to build.
To take over and,
So it was warriors at the front with the families behind.
And sometimes I mean, it was. I'm possibly conflating the peasant crusade with the professional crusades, but even the professional crusaders, it's known they had women and children. It was just, these were what they were. The crusades, what you have to understand, were armed pilgrimages. That's how you have to understand them. They were pilgrimages, but now they were armed. And not only are we armed, we're taking the offensive to the people who have been attacking us.
Right.
So that's exactly when we were talking about the word crusade and what it means.
So that's actually important because as you've already said earlier in this conversation, doing the pilgrimage had become it was a fairly normal part of European life. I mean, it would have been expensive. So presumably it wouldn't have been peasants doing it, right? It would have been the wealthier classes, or was it more normal than that? Was there a kind of harsh version for Christians?
No. The pilgrimage was always there, and a lot of it was sometimes as a form of penance. Okay, because you've done something bad in life, a penance would be imposed on you to go and suffer. Because to do the pilgrimage, everyone knew you're going to suffer and possibly die. Okay. So it was, but it was also a holy thing, It was noble, it was honorable, but get ready for some action, You might not make it, and it was understood as that. But like I said, it was always going on until so. But these First Crusaders, that's the best way to understand it. We were talking about the term and how it was understood. It was actually understood as a mass pilgrimage, which is why it was full of women and children. Okay.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. So now we finally come to the Knights Templar.
Finally.
Which is founded in 1119.
Right.
And this is the topic of your book, of course. Yeah. So to someone who has no idea what the Knights Templar is, what they were, why were they founded, who are they, what is it?
Sure. Okay, so the kingdom of Jerusalem is now conquered, or as the Christians see it, reconquered, and it's under Christian Latin Crusader rule. And now a new problem poses itself. Okay, they've created this enclave, and it's safe, it's secure because it's a kingdom. And now more pilgrims than ever are coming because, our brothers are there, and they've already created a little niche for us. They have Jerusalem, okay? So now you get a big mass, a burgeoning mass of pilgrimage. But guess what? All around these kingdoms are still Muslims, all of them smarting from what just happened. Okay, being beaten and being ousted and losing,
Yes, I'm sure they thought it was hilarious, Raymond.
Yeah. Well, no. My point is they're waiting for vengeance.
Right.
And so these European pilgrims who come get mauled. It's even worse than before. En route. Exactly. So yeah, once you get to Jerusalem, you'll be safe.
And they're still walking across Europe.
Yeah, and oftentimes sailing.
Okay.
And they'd go to the port of Jaffa, for example, and then the fortress of Ascalon, which was this massive fortress run by Muslims, would always, once the Christians would go in a narrow defile, they would just come out and attack and kill them.
And Jaffa was at that point not Christian, or was it Christian? Did the Christians take Jaffa?
Yeah.
Okay.
They did, but
okay.
Ascalon, which was nearby, was
Ascalon's further south. Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So these, you have now all
the pilgrimage is going full force.
And so the Knights Templar, what is this?
So what happens is a man, Hugh of Pains, I think it's pronounced, Pines or Pains, P-A-Y-N-S, a Frenchman.
P-A-Y-E-N-S, I think.
Yeah. Well, I've seen it in both spellings, but anyway, he's a French crusader who actually fought in the First Crusade, went back to France, and then decided to come back to the Holy Land, settle permanently. And he was, according to the sources, just devastated by what was happening to pilgrims. Okay, and so he and another knight by the name of Godfrey from St. Omer, I believe, and another knight, we only know this other knight's name, Godfrey, and for a total of 9 knights, so they found 7 other knights, created a band of a brotherhood, who was just dedicated to escorting pilgrims to prevent them from being mauled. Okay, and just 7 knights, and they called themselves the poor fellow soldiers of Jesus Christ. And again, look at that, fellow soldiers of Jesus Christ. Think of the idea, Jesus Christ, I'm a soldier, like he's a soldier. Okay, that was common to them. And they were actually, so in 1019 is when they initially form, and they get the blessing of, the patriarch there and the king at the time, who I believe is Baldwin II, gives them temporary residence in what they thought was Solomon's temple, but it's Al-Aqsa Mosque. Okay, and that's how they got the name the Templars, because they're the Knights of the Temple.
Mm-hmm.
Right, and then 10 years later, I mentioned Saint Bernard of Clairvaux. He's a very important figure. He actually very much justifies and rationalizes, including from theology, and he talks about the 2 swords of Christ, like I told you, the one secular and the one spiritual.
Sorry, just one point. The Al-Aqsa Mosque, that was built on King Solomon's temple.
Right.
And were the Muslims were cleared out at that point? Right.
Yeah.
But they left the mosque, or...
Yeah,
it would have been...
but to the Christians, the mosque was still the temple.
Right,
yeah.
Okay. That's the temple mount.
Called it, yeah. And there's some theories that maybe they were actually somewhere else, but let's stay with the normal, interpretation, which is that, okay, the Al-Aqsa / temple. And anyway, so Saint Bernard, very important figure. This guy was, he's like the most important cleric and theologian of his century, the 12th century. And he was just a fanatic about the military orders, and he wrote so much. He promoted. He wrote I quote it extensively in my book. It's called "The New Knighthood," and where he talks about enough of knights fighting for gain and worldliness. It's time for them to be monks and to be warriors of God. Okay, and he long treatises that he writes. All of this 10 years later, after 1119 and 1129. At a council of Troyes, they become formalized and they get as an order, and they become history's first military order. So there were all kinds of Christian orders up until then. This was the first actual military order, which was a new thing. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
And it got the Pope's blessing and so forth. And their attire was to wear white, which was symbolic of their purity because they're trying to live pious Christian lives as monks. And a few years later, they also got the Red Cross as a badge, meaning their willingness to be martyred on behalf of Christendom, on behalf of Christ, on behalf of Christians.
So actually now when we see, let's say, English football fans wearing the sort of mail with the kind of white sheet and the Red Cross, that is accurate.
The Templars.
That does the work.
It's associated now with, St. George, and because of some sort of conflation, but it really starts with the Knights of the Temple. And anyway, so that's the rise of the Knights of the Temple. And what was it for? Because, we've already conquered Jerusalem, but the war is still raging. We're still surrounded by enemies, Muslims.
So it wasn't just protecting pilgrims who were coming in and out. It was also, were they trying to increase their territory when they were there?
No. Their primary purpose in the beginning was just to protect pilgrims, but very soon they essentially morphed into doing that, but also being a elite commando force dedicated to fighting Islam. And I think the logic became, if we want to protect Christians, well, we are in de facto war with Islam because Muslims are always going to attack. So in other words, it became oftentimes, let's preempt this instead of waiting until Christians get attacked, or then we would. So whenever there would be a war in this early era, and a Crusader king would go to war against this or that Muslim leader, they would be right at the front. Okay,
but firstly, from the Muslims' point of view, the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the third holiest site. So this is, sure, the other territory losses would have been an offense, and those killed would have been a huge offense. But losing the Al-Aqsa must have been, for them, there must have been a terrible reaction to that.
Right. The Al-Aqsa Mosque and the dome, the golden, the dome on the rock. Remember, these were built specifically in a way to look down at the Holy Sepulchre. Those particular buildings were built by a caliph in the late 8th century, I want to say. And the inscriptions around them are all hostile, especially to Christianity. So around the Dome of the Rock, which is right adjacent from Al-Aqsa Mosque, it has all the Quran verses which say, God does not have a son. God is not one of three. And infidels are they who say God is, infidels are they who say Jesus. Anyway, so my point is, in as much as it was important to Muslims, that region, it was also seen, it was created in a way as a sort of superiority to Christianity, which it had supplanted. So it was doubly offensive that it was now retaken by Christians in that sense.
Okay. And the Crusaders themselves, were they splitting into separate kingdoms there at this point, or is that later?
Yeah, well, eventually, right from the beginning, you had counties and principalities and kingdoms. The kingdom of Jerusalem being the most notable, but they worked together. They weren't like enemies. It's because they were conquered in piecemeal. Right. So, like I said, Edessa was the very first one, I think, in maybe 1098, and it was by Baldwin the First. And then later, Antioch was taken by Bohemond, and then finally the rest of the Crusaders took Jerusalem, and Godfrey was elected the first, the protector as it was, and then other kingdoms, Muslim regions fell, and someone else took them. So they all worked together, but they were their own independently ruled. They all had their own. It was still feudalism. Feudalism had moved to the Middle East. You see,
right? Okay. Yeah. So back to the Knights Templar. It isn't the 12th century that Temple Church is built in London, and I think it's based on the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's a very different type of building which still stands today. I think it might have got hit in the Second World War by some German bombs, but and as a side point, by the way, Hans Zimmer used the organ in that temple for the soundtrack to Interstellar. But that's very much a side point, obviously. But is the fact that Temple Church exists in London suggests to me that they're going back and forth. There's a kind of a kind of route there. It becomes a new.
What happened after the council that I mentioned in 1129, where they became formalized, is the Templars' popularity exploded all throughout Europe. And they got tons of donations. This is the whole myth that they're so rich, which is true. They were very rich because they got so much in donations by lots and lots of Europeans. They were very inspired by this particular military, the only military order. So they got donations, lands, money, and that would explain what's also happening in as distant as England, from the Holy Land. And what they would do is they would create preceptories or commanderies all around. So that temple in London or England you're talking about, that's what it was, where they would have basically bases all throughout Europe. To raise money and to raise recruits and to train them and to send them to the Holy Land. So it was like a continuous supply. Okay. And they also had them on the routes to the Holy Land as well.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably good right now to actually bring in the Hospitallers because
this is the Knights Hospitallers,
right? The Knights of the Hospital. So they're, as I always say, they're older and newer. So the hospital had existed, and this is another interesting story. It goes back to this goes back to the times of Charlemagne and Harun al-Rashid, the Abbasid Caliphate, who are said to have good relations, and because actually, according to Charlemagne's biographer, the only reason Charlemagne wanted to be so friendly with Muslim leaders was so he can lessen the yoke on the Christian subjects of these Muslim leaders. So at any rate, during that time, the Holy Sepulchre is there, and pilgrims are coming and sometimes being abused and having nowhere to sleep. So a small hospice formed that Harun al-Rashid permitted and that Charlemagne had funded. Okay, basically a hospice, meaning Christians come, you can serve them, you refresh them, give them a place to sleep. Not a hospital, but a hospice. Okay, even though it's called hospital.
So this is in the 9th century.
Yeah, this is the beginning of it. Is in the 9th century. And then, with the vicissitudes of time and the rise of the Turks, it disappears for a while. But then it starts coming back because the Holy Sepulchre is still there. After it was destroyed in 1009, by the way, it was rebuilt. Christians, the Byzantines had to rebuild it, a smaller version. But so another hospice grows there. It's founded by these Amalfi Italian merchants, right around 1050. Okay, and it's abused and attacked, but it exists to offer whatever succor to Europeans. And in fact, one of the earliest one was for women, because men would come and visit the monks and stay with the monks, but there would be women, and they're not going to let women with the monks. So the first hospice was for women. Okay, and then it got popular, and then they made another one, a hospital for men. Okay, now it's just a hospice, and this is why the Knights of the Hospitallers are even more interesting to me, as you'll see, because these are people who were so committed to serving mankind. They give the shirt off in their codes. The way they talk about the sick as the sick our lords. Okay, so they were very much actuated by Christ when he would say, if you do this, that, or the other thing to the least of me, my brethren, you've done it to me.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why they were, given over to very altruistic deeds, helping their fellow man, the Christian pilgrims. So they would do all that and, go through the violence here and there, outbursts by the Seljuks and whatnot. And then finally, when the First Crusade comes in 1099, so now it's in Jerusalem. And the man who's, he's called Blessed Gerard. Okay. He was the head abbot of the hospital, and supposedly, they kept him, the Muslims, they kicked all the Christians out when the siege began, when the Crusaders came, as possible fifth columns.
The Muslims kicked all the
Christians out, but they kept him because he was good enough to help serve anyone. In the hospice, he would serve Muslims and Jews and whoever, so he wouldn't discriminate. Anyway, they kept him there, and he becomes the sort of the kind of the founder, the name remembered with the hospital. And then so they conquer it, the Christians, the Crusaders, and now the hospital starts to grow. All right. But then before long, what happens is right around the time of the Templars, another shift starts happening in the hospital, where they realize that why are we just sitting by doing nothing and waiting for Christian pilgrims to get mauled, and then we have to take care of them and try to heal them and try to bring them back to some semblance of life? Why don't we go on the offensive to prevent it from happening? Okay, so they slowly become militarized. Okay. And
so what is this is of the sort of what kind of period are we talking from the arrival of the Crusades in 1099 in Jerusalem to
It starts getting militarized under the second master of the hospital, Raymond of Puy. Okay, and this I want to say, so Gerard, the one I told you, dies very early after the First Crusade, maybe something like 1110 or 1115. Okay, and then this guy Raymond, so he's the one who's credited with militarizing it, but it's a very slow process. It's not like overnight they become militarized, and it starts, like I would say, between 1120, 1120s, and until right around 1160s, when you finally have definitive proof that they are now on the warpath fighting. Okay. But it goes slowly and slowly. But now what I find very interesting is the combination, okay, of who so the Hospitallers start off as these people, these altruists who are just committed to helping their fellow man. Okay, they're nurses essentially. Okay, and they give them their bed, they feed them, they clean and dress their wounds, they bathe them. Okay, this is the kind of guy, the man they are. And at the same time, that same Christian, who you can't even find today, became a ferocious warrior, okay? Which is kind of an interesting conundrum. Again, from our mentality, it's hard to, but for them, it makes sense. Like I said, on the one hand, why wait and let Christians get killed and mauled when I can actually do something to protect them, okay? And if I do love my fellow man the way Christ commands me to, why would I sit by idly when I know they will be raided and attacked? So they became like the Templars, and they started being escorts and guiding pilgrims, just like the Templars. So I think even more than the Templars, the Hospitallers really underscore how these two seemingly different virtues, if you like, which is extreme piety and the kind, not just piety but love of serving fellow man with violence. Okay, again, doesn't that it's like saying a nurse who's dedicated to war,
right?
Okay. In our modern kind of parlance. But that's what they were. But
and to what extent was it necessity? I mean,
exactly.
It was at a certain point they don't have a choice; so they actually have to defend themselves.
And then, which goes back to our earlier conversation about just war. I think if Jesus was there, he would understand and agree,
because it would have been relentless attacks from
right. It's kind of like. And especially in the context of the centurion, and he didn't tell him to quit the army, even though this man was killing people, and the Roman centurion was probably not involved in just war, because Rome was an expansive power, expanding and conquering. Okay, I expect Roman centurions were killing people for not necessarily just causes, and he still didn't condemn him. So surely for protecting our fellow man.
But
what's that?
We don't need to I don't think he condoned him either.
Well, he did praise him,
but not for
his faith.
He praised him for his faith, specifically. Yeah. What was the relationship between the Templars and the Hospitallers? Were they in contention with each other?
Well, in origins, they were separate orders. They very much learned to work together. In fact, in their statutes, a Templar, for example, had to fight to the death until the Templar, the banner came down. But if it came down and the Hospitaller nearby was up, he'd go there and fight with them. Okay. And the same vice versa. So they did have sort of a close, I mean, they were their own brotherhoods, but they were still very much worked together. And oftentimes when a crusading army would march, so they became the backbone of all the crusading armies, which were run by kings, King Richard and his men, or whoever. And they would often, one would would be at the vanguard and one would be in the rear. Okay, right. One would protect. So even in a crusading army, they were the protectors of the marching pilgrims, because that's what, remember, Crusaders are. So they would protect the rear and the front, and they were wherever the fighting was thickest, they were there.
And what would they have considered themselves? Would they have been sort of Frankish and Germanic backgrounds? You mentioned Richard there, but this is a little bit later, I think, right? And this is the Third Crusade. Yeah. These early European men, it's more French, German.
The word, and it's kind of hard too, especially when you look at the Arabic sources, because from the Arabic point of view, they're all Franks.
They're all Franks.
We still have that word in the Arabic language. It's even colloquialized.
Which just could mean Europeans, though.
Yeah, from today, if you're speaking Arabic, if I say he's a Frengi, I mean he's a European. Okay, so, but yeah, by and large, most of them probably came from what we would call modern-day France. But it was the Normans as well. It was, the Germans. It was Italians.
Okay.
A lot of Spaniards would have wanted to go, but they were involved in their own crusade, and actually more than one pope would ban them from going on that crusade because they had their own crusade in Spain.
Right. Okay. So we've got to this period now where the Christians, the Crusaders, have some sort of control in the Holy Land. We've got the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers who have sort of come up and are this kind of special forces for them. And you still have new crusades coming, right? If I can fast forward a little bit, 1147, and I've understood this to be the Second Crusade. The ordering is a bit, or rather, the names of these crusades is a bit complicated to me if you include the People's Crusade. But this is Eugene III. Again, it's more Frankish and Germanic crusades. I want us to eventually get to the Fourth Crusade, which is, in my understanding, like a disaster Christian on Christian nightmare. And we'll do past then another time. But I think this sort of 200-year period of rule. Can you take me to the next Crusades and the relevance or significance and what we understand about those?
Right. Okay. So the Second Crusade, it takes place. What initiated is Christmas Day, 1144. Edessa, the oldest county that was actually reconquered by Baldwin that I mentioned to you, was sacked on Christmas Day by this his name is Zengi, basically an Atabeg or a Turkish warlord. And the atrocities are just beyond horrific, and they're widely recorded. And the thing is, a lot of people don't realize this, but Edessa at this time was mostly Armenians and Syriac Christians, and the ruling elite were the Franks. Okay, but they all got killed. The patriarch, I mentioned to you Matthew of Edessa as a very important historian of the crusading era. He was actually there, and he got killed, by the Turks. Anyway, so that propelled the Second Crusade.
Okay.
That sack.
And so that news, again, same story again.
Same story.
The news gets back to Europe.
Yeah.
Outrage.
Exactly.
Christian sort of unity.
Right.
People pick up arms and they do what they consider to be honorable to go over there. And are they successful? Do they?
No. This one is a complete disaster. And there's various reasons why, but it's hard to even get into why. But this is also where the Templars show their stuff, because they're still small at this time. This is 1144, a little after 1144, and I told you they were formalized 1129, and so they're still a small group. But they actually, I don't want to make this about the Templars, but even it's an unmitigated disaster, and a lot of it has to do with poor strategies and logistics on the Christians' part. And a lot of it also, according to some, is because they thought they were trying to live off the legacy of the first Crusaders, who were basically their forebears, great-great-grandfathers, and who were seen as so heroic. So they wanted to kind of live through that, but they didn't have their mettle, apparently. And they just completely, it was like I said, poor strategy and just, and bickering between the leaders and all that sort of thing. So nothing whatsoever was gained with the Second Crusade, except, like I said, it's the Templars start coming into their own, and you can see how people, including the kings, the French king at the time, Louis VII, he actually really relied on them in many ways, even though they were still a small new force. Okay, and then so this is really the story. After the First Crusade, it's all downhill. Okay, now between the Second Crusade and the Third Crusade is the rise of Saladin.
Right.
And especially right around 1170 is where he really becomes prominent. He takes over Egypt, and he becomes a sultan of Egypt. And he starts after he wins over more Muslim territories and brings them under his control. He essentially starts to surround the Crusader kingdoms, which was his plan, to completely surround them.
Because Al-Aqsa has got to be reclaimed.
Yeah, and
presumably that's the prize. Am I right in thinking, is that the prize goal?
Yeah, actually the fellow before, remember Zengi, the guy I told you who did Edessa, who conquered Edessa? His son, Nur al-Din, is really the man or the sultan who's credited with bringing back jihad. Okay, so it no longer became just, we're fighting these Franks. It became an articulated jihad, and that man, Nur al-Din, had all sorts of booklets and books about the jihad and the hadith about the jihad taught, and so he really propagandized jihadist rhetoric. Saladin, who actually worked under him originally, he was young, much younger, but then took over, also played the same game. He presented himself, and he also marshaled jihadist war logic against the infidel. So he definitely used that, which is to go to your point. Al-Aqsa was very important. We have to cleanse it from these filthy infidels.
Right, okay. So, and this is also when Richard the Lionheart is coming on the scene. Is this, how much are the English involved in the Crusades before Richard the Lionheart?
They were always involved right from the beginning, and not necessarily in huge numbers. Mostly, like I said, if I were to give it in order, I would say it was the Franks and then the Normans, and then a sprinkling of everyone else.
Okay. But the Normans obviously conquer it after 1066, so they are in control in England. So there is a...
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, the Battle of Hastings in 1066 is just a few decades before the First Crusade. But before the Third Crusade and before we get to Richard, the most pivotal event happens is that Saladin conquers Jerusalem.
Right.
Okay. In 1180. The Battle of Hattin in 1187,
which is the subject of the film with Orlando Bloom.
Right.
I've forgotten the name of the film.
Yeah, Kingdom of Heaven.
Kingdom of Heaven, which I think the last time we spoke, you expressed quite deep umbrage with.
It's an amusing movie, but it's historically inaccurate
because you think they glossed Saladin.
That, and they make the Templars. They basically, in these movies, what they do is they take the guys who are like religious and make them into fools, and then they take the guy who, not that, Balian, the way they portray him, he was not like that at all, like some kind of secular dude who's like, can we all live along? That was anachronistic what you're doing. So they remold and refashion the Crusades after our image, basically. And that's my main umbrage with them.
Right. So Saladin recaptures Jerusalem, and Richard the Lionheart.
That's what propels the Third Crusade and Richard the Lionheart.
And what's the story of Richard the Lionheart then? When he arrives in the Holy Land, how does that go for him?
So Richard Lionheart, only a couple of years earlier, became king. His father, King Henry II, died. And actually, both King Henry, his father, and he had taken the cross. Meaning they were getting ready to go to the Holy Land to help reclaim Jerusalem, but his father died. Now he's king, and that delayed him a little bit to consolidate his power. But also he created what's called a Saladin tax or tithe to raise money from the peasants to help with the war effort, and he actually did bring a very substantial war machine. King Philip as well came. And they were the two kings, but Philip, they came and they fought, and it's a lot of it is the Third Crusade is probably the most savage of all.
Really?
Yeah, like the most brutal, just fighting and desperate, existential struggle. I mean,
is it the same motivations as you've described before?
Yeah, it's even more
so because
it's calcified even now.
Because there's Christian soldiers who have lost their lives.
And
so there's
exactly.
got to honor the forefathers.
And we've had Jerusalem for almost a century. So it's very brutal. The idea of losing it again was just traumatizing, and the Muslims are now on the warpath, and they're the jihadist logic. So it was extremely violent. But the end of it is they don't reclaim the Holy Land, but they make a lot of progress. Right before the Third Crusade, before Richard came, Saladin's grand wish was to expel all the Crusader kingdoms. So he took Jerusalem, and he took others, but there were still, of course, little pockets here and there. The biggest one was Acre, which he actually did conquer for a little while. And then when Richard came and Philip, the war started there until they reclaimed Acre, the Christians, and that became the kingdom of Jerusalem was there now.
Okay.
So that became the new Jerusalem, kind of like a temporary area.
But Jerusalem was never captured again.
No. It was never captured again. But after the Third Crusade, they made peace, and Christians were allowed to go back to Jerusalem as pilgrims and not be molested. So what Richard did is, he made sure that Saladin didn't culminate what he wanted to by expelling them entirely, which he came close to doing. So he gave them breathing room, basically, Richard, for almost another century. And he won back a few territories that Saladin had conquered as well, but not Jerusalem. So that after the First Crusade, really the Third Crusade is considered the most successful.
Right.
Okay, though it didn't achieve its ultimate goal.
Right.
And then, we talked about the Fourth Crusade.
The Fourth Crusade, yeah. So at this point, and now we're talking sort of 1202.
Yeah.
So we've had over a century, but it seems to go. This is just war out the window. They try and sack Constantinople from the Christians. Who are the Fourth Crusade Crusaders? Who is it that's leading this?
Right.
Why does it go so awry in motivation and everything? What happens here?
Okay, so it's a group of Crusaders. They were supposed to head to Egypt because at this point now Egypt has become the focal point of the Crusade. Richard wanted to attack Egypt, and the idea was you could never hold Jerusalem without taking Egypt because that's where all the manpower was constantly coming from. And so they needed ships, and they got these Venetians to build them ships. And then when the time came, only a few Crusaders showed up, and others because they went different routes, and they couldn't pay for the ships. And the Venetians, held them accountable and said, you owe us money, and this was a big thing, of course, at the time. So they made a deal with them. The Venetians said they had some enemy, some business trade enemy, a Christian, okay, and they said if you join us to help conquer them, we'll call it even. Okay, you don't have to pay for the ships.
Yeah.
And they did that, and they conquered. And then after that, when they did that, that was already a small group of Crusaders, and they got excommunicated for it. Okay, so the Pope immediately annulled them and said, "You're out. You're not even Christians at this point." Okay, so they were again.
Right. Okay.
So again, you see that the official leaders were against it, the Pope. And then that same group somehow ends up in this a Byzantine kind of literally Byzantine as labyrinth and warped relation with ousted Byzantine prince who wants to come back and reclaim his throne, and he wins them over and says, "If you help me get Constantinople, I'm going to help you with the crusade, and I'll give you money." And, they help him. Long story short, everything goes awry. And before you know it, you got that small group of Crusaders running amok in Constantinople.
But they do successfily sack it.
Yeah, they do.
Right.
Yeah,
and they take
pretty
power
horrific.
there.
Yeah.
And how many people are killed in that? Or is it...
a great many.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have the
Christian people.
Christians, yeah.
Yeah.
And but again, those same Crusaders are all excommunicated by the church and condemned. Okay,
Right.
So that's what I mean. This was one of those things that, definitely went awry and did not have official backing. So I think it was Pope Innocent III. He was just outraged and mortified by what had happened. Okay, and he completely condemned it. People love to throw the Fourth Crusade kind of like, it's the aha moment, which I don't really understand what it is they hope to prove. Well, hang
on a second. I mean, it is a bit of an aha moment. I mean, I guess you're trying to make the point that this Fourth Crusade represents all of the Crusades being
No, my point is that I never for once think that the Crusades and the Crusaders were angels. Okay, this is war. These are humans. There's bad stuff's going to happen. Okay, the motivation, the impetus for it is good, and I think a lot of them did behave correctly. But of course, man being man, whether he's called a Christian or not, is going to engage in attacking the Jews, attacking fellow Christians, misbehavior. So I think the people who use it as an aha moment, they almost think that or if you speak well about the Crusades, that somehow I think it's always everywhere perfect and idealistic. No, I mean, at the heart of it is fallen, corrupt man. So I expect all sorts of bad things. In fact, the shocker is that we didn't get more of that sort of thing, actually. So that's why I'm saying it's not that much of an aha moment for me, because bad people do bad things, whether they call themselves Christians or not. But the pivotal point, or the most important point to me, is that the official leaders were against it. And that's really, how can you attack an institution? You can't attack an institution if some of its members go rogue, even though the leaders say and condemn them. So I don't think it's as much of an aha moment that people like to use as they think it is.
So we've still at this point got another sort of 100 years of several other crusades, which we don't have time to go into.
Less than 100, but
slightly less than 100. And before the European Christians are completely ousted from, or I guess there would have been some remnants remaining. When it comes to the Templars and Hospitallers, can you tie the bow on these, because presumably they weren't involved in the Fourth Crusade, right?
No,
Right. They would have stayed in the Holy Land.
Exactly, because their whole purpose is the Holy Land. They're not
Okay, so what happens to these two organizations?
So as time goes by, and it actually makes sense for us to kind of speed up that last century after the Fourth Crusade, the Knights of the Temple and Hospital become more and more central to any crusading venture. Because what happens now is, and this is the whole story, it's one of numbers, okay? The Crusaders from the start are a small number because they're surrounded by a sea of Islam, okay? And they always need to be replenished from Europe. And with every passing year, the replenishing becomes less and less and less, in part because of secularization. The first Crusaders, it's understood, they were way more pious than even the third, and definitely more than the fifth. And, okay? So there's this sort of thing where they become smaller and smaller in numbers, and a lot of the secular European Crusaders, even the ones who were they call them the natives, who were born there, Franks that had been there generations, would sell their landings and leave, go to Europe, because it was that dangerous. So they started filling the vacuum, the military orders. And so with every passing year, we're now in the 13th century, the 1200s, you find them more and more at the heart of the crusade, until we reach the final siege of Acre in 1291, which is when they get expelled. And basically, they're in charge of the whole thing. The man who's in charge is the master of the temple, who's actually in charge of the defense of Acre, and he gets killed, of course. And in 1291, that's it. That's the official historical date where it all ends, because now with the final fall of Acre, and there's just a few more kingdoms, and they all capitulate because it's pointless, and that's the end of the Crusaders. They leave and never really come back. But if we stick and if we talk about especially the Hospitallers, their crusade continues for many more centuries.
Against who?
Well, you want me to get into it?
Well, we can save that. I'm sure it's in the book.
Yeah. No, I want to get into it, but I mean, before we wrap the bow on the Crusades in 1291, this is another story, the Knights of the Hospital and what they do, and I'll get into it. But if you want to say anything else about Crusades,
I mean, the big question is what you said earlier that you asked.
Right.
Are they glorious?
Okay, good. So let's get to that. And actually, I was already touching on that with the numbers. So a lot of historians and critics of the Crusades, they love to laugh and go, "Oh, they lost. Who cares? What's the point?" And the point isn't so much if they win or win or lose. It's what they represented and what motivated them, which we discussed briefly. But it's the number game, okay? And I think the best way to give you an analogy, to me, the Crusades are actually very impressive because they lasted as long as they did. It's not that they failed. That was destined. That had to happen, as I'll explain. But that they actually persevered for 2 centuries is an amazing testimony to a stalwart will. And what I mean by that is think about what they did. Here's what, let me compare it to what Muslims did. And not just Muslims, but any world conquerors, okay? What they do is, here's the Muslims. They start in Arabia, and they start conquering, right? So they conquer Syria and Egypt, and then once they consolidate them, they continue to Libya, consolidate, continue on to Algeria, Tunisia, consolidate, get to Morocco, consolidate, get to Spain. Okay, so what that does is you're always conquering your immediate neighbor, and that means I have all my manpower, all my resources, all my fallback world behind me, my reserves, right? And if I lose, I'm just a short march back home where I'm safe. And if I win, well, we consolidate this new territory, turn it into ours, garrison it, and then continue. That's the logical way to do it, okay? And that makes sense. Now, the Crusaders didn't do that because the Muslims did that. Why? Because who's their enemy? Well, it's their neighbor. He's an infidel. Okay, you're an infidel, that makes you our enemy, we're going to conquer you. The Crusaders weren't about conquering anyone because he's an infidel. They were about the Holy Land, as we discussed. So what that required is for them to just hurl themselves into a sea of Islam instead of doing what Muslims would have done, which is conquer it piece by piece. That wasn't their purpose. They weren't out to conquer Muslim lands. They just wanted the Holy Land because of what was happening. So the fact that you had this tiny dwindling, Europeans in an ocean of pure Islam, and that's the whole point. When you look especially at the later battles and sieges, it's kind of like 1 against 1,000. Okay, you have 200 Knights Templars at the Battle of Acre, the last one. it's just a few thousand fighters in total, and a few hundred Templars and Hospitallers, and then you have something like 200,000 Muslims outside. Okay, so that is the tenor of the whole thing. And to me, it's remarkable that that's the heroic aspect, that these guys could last that long for centuries. And to give you, and by way of analogy, this would require, for example, imagine if Muslims, instead of doing what I said they had done, after they conquered North Africa, they decided, you know what, we're going to sail to France and we're going to carve a little kingdom right there. And they do that. And then all of Christendom, all the Franks and the Germans and the English and the Italians, all of them can attack and do attack them. And the Muslims persevere and stay there for 2 centuries. I think that would be seen as very noble and heroic.
Well, that happened in Spain for 8 centuries.
Yeah, but that's part of the ongoing thing that I was describing. In other words, they weren't an enclave. Spain was connected to North Africa, which was all Islamic.
Right. Okay.
It's the Islamic advance. You see, I'm talking about going in where the whole thing is Muslim or Christian, and you're in the center by yourself. Okay. So the Spanish example would not be that, because that was after all of Africa was taken, Straits of Gibraltar, and then they went in. So my point is, I do think, and this isn't even what I'm saying to you isn't exactly novel. A lot of people have said this. That's what makes them so heroic, that it's not that they lost, it's that they could last for so long under such amazing odds.
Right. So it's certainly remarkable.
Yeah.
Glorious, though, is still a word.
Yeah, glorious is a subjective thing. And it's,
but you think they were glorious?
Oh, well, I mean, I don't use the word glorious often, so probably I wouldn't use that word, glorious. I think they were remarkable. I think they were heroic.
I'll tell you what is glorious. It's your face under the beard. But they're remarkable.
Okay.
They're remarkable. Certainly.
They're remarkable,
I mean, even I think their Muslim opponents would have thought it was remarkable, because they'd have been like,
and it comes out often in the sources I quote them, especially in the Two Swords, where the Muslims, especially, they had this kind of begrudging fear and hate for the Knights of the Temple and the Hospital, because they saw them as the crack troops. These were like the Green Berets of the Crusades, or the Navy SEALs.
I'm sure historians don't like moralizing or engaging with trying to justify things that happen in history, because I guess the role of the historian is to explain what happened and to try and understand incentives. But I think there is a question about whether they were in fact just wars. You might shut this question down, but do you think any of the Crusades were just indeed?
Yeah, okay, so they were just in the sense that, one, the just war, what I'm going to say is what just war does encompass, okay? So one, it was reclaiming lost territory that was conquered, okay? As I told you, when Islam came on the scene, all that territory that they conquered, including the Holy Land, was part of the Christian world, okay? In the 7th century, in the 7th century, it was part of the Roman Empire. Okay, and it had been for centuries. So from their perspective, this is our territory. You've stolen it, you've conquered it. It's incumbent on us to reconquer it. It's not unlike the Reconquista.
Well, sure, I know that they thought it was just war.
Yeah.
I'm trying to ask whether you think it was just war.
I would agree with that logic. It was Christian. It was conquered, and then, adding insult to injury, it wasn't just conquered, but the people there were continuously oppressed. The holy sites were continuously attacked. So it wasn't just, okay, we conquered, but we're going to allow you to, like, for example, they say the Mongols were pretty tolerant, right? And the Mongols would conquer people and they were pretty brutal, but you can have whatever religion you want. Under Islam, you can have your religion, but you're going to be basically a degraded second-class citizen and lose all sorts of rights. In fact, it's funny because a lot of times the Mongols actually didn't like the Muslims in the early stages. And one of the things they would always do is, when they would conquer an Islamic region, is give full rights to Christians and Jews. And that would upset, the Muslims would write about
Are we talking about Genghis Khan now?
Yeah, well, not him. He didn't reach the Muslim lands. He had died, but his sons.
His sons,
His sons, yeah.
His grandsons, yeah.
Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah,
but they were eventually converted to Islam.
One group of them, the Golden Horde up by Russia, which is the Central Asian states now, the descendants of it. But so it's just in the sense that this was seen as, I see it like that.
I wasn't expecting that. Not just a Crusader apologist, but a Genghis Khan apologist, all in one. Talk about controversial opinions.
I'm not apologizing for Genghis Khan, but he was kind of cool. No, no, but the Mongols are known. I mean, they were as brutal as anyone gets. Their infamous mountains of. But it's also interesting to
mountains
note
of
skulls and human heads. But it's also interesting to note that history's most savage of all Mongol Turkic warlords was Muslim, and I'm talking about Timur-Lenk, Timur the Great, Timur the Lame.
Yeah,
and it's interesting too because a lot of historians like to distance him and say, no, he wasn't Muslim.
And he was an Uzbek, right?
Yeah. And he claimed to be a descendant of Genghis Khan, but some say he really wasn't. But it's interesting because even he actually fought the Hospitallers, the Knights of the Hospital, in person.
Really?
Yeah, when he was a very old man.
And what period are we now with?
So this is right around very late 1200s, early 1300.
Timur-Lenk is in the European imagination as well. I think it's Marlowe who wrote a play. It was, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So these characters really do make it all the way across the other side of the European continent.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
Especially Timur-Lenk. He's, arguably the greatest warlord. I don't mean in a moral sense. I'm just saying
in terms of what he
as
accomplished.
far as a tactician and strategist and his far sprung conquests of people. I don't think he ever lost a battle.
So look, I don't want to discourage people from you reading your book, and I'm sure, like last time, by the way, I told you this off camera, but it sold out in the UK on Amazon after our conversation. But the Templars and the Hospitallers, or the Hospitallers, continue after this period. Now, we don't need to have that whole. That's part 3.
Yeah.
But maybe you can give me a taste.
Sure. Let's leave the Templars for a bit because their history is going to end quickly and in a very graphic way. So let's look at the Hospitallers. They're still alive, actually. As an order, they still exist. But so basically after the fall of Acre, they're now in Cyprus. That's now the closest Christian kingdom to the Mediterranean. They have a base there. And they're still making plans on getting back to Jerusalem.
Good lads.
But yeah, no more Europeans are just not buying. No one's doing it anymore, so they're just alone. So what they do is they still want to protect pilgrims, whichever are coming. Because remember, pilgrimage was not just something you do when it's safe. You do it when it's not safe, and you think you might die, and that's part of the risk, So, but they became a naval power. So first they took over the island of Rhodes. Okay, right, southwest of the modern day Turkey. And this was at the time of the rise of the Ottomans. Okay, and in the south, you have the Mamluks, who actually were the ones who evicted the Crusaders out in 1291. And they start patrolling the seas and becoming basically helping Christian merchants and pilgrims against Muslim pirates who were attacking them at the time. Okay, and Rhodes becomes fortified. It became arguably the most fortified kingdom in the world. It was just you can still see it too till this very day. And they become a thorn in the Ottoman Sultan's side. Okay, now this is the rise of the great Ottomans who terrorize everyone, but they can never get rid of these guys. And finally, in 13, Muhammad, the conqueror of Constantinople, Mehmed or Muhammad II, who conquered in 1453, he couldn't stand these guys because they were always, like a nuisance. Yeah. Okay, they're not a big threat, but they're always messing with his plans. So finally, in 1479 or 1480, he said that's enough, and he raised a humongous army, armada, and they still lost the Muslims. And he was very furious with it, and he ended up dying like a few months after that. So that was like a big win. A lot of the Christians in Romania, I think all Christians were singing the praises of the knights for being able to withstand all the power that the Ottomans, who had just conquered not just Constantinople, but after 1453, many more regions of European regions, and they couldn't take the little island of the knights. Wow. So it just shows you. And then, long story short, finally they do get evicted in 1522 by Suleiman the Magnificent. And they become the homeless Hospitallers. They are living basically in boats until Charles V gives them Malta. Okay. And this isn't altruism. Yeah, this isn't altruism. He actually puts them there because now this is the time of the great. These always existed, but now the earlier 16th century is the beginning of the mass slave raids, Muslim Barbary coast attacking European.
That starts as early as the 16th century.
Yeah, in the early 1500s.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons that Charles gave them Malta is he wanted them right there in the center of the Mediterranean to work as a guard patrol, which they did.
Wow.
And and very frequently they prevented the Barbary. Now, this is a time very interesting in and of itself, because this is when mass slavery is going on in North Africa, in the Barbary coast.
Not only that, you also have the Turks now well into Europe.
Yeah.
So we're filming in Budapest now. They're actually, they're here. It's fun.
So the Ottoman Turks are all throughout the Balkans, in Budapest, enslaving the Tartars, who became Muslim, the Golden Horde in the Crimean peninsula. They're mass slavers of the Slavic peoples. And then you got the Muslims of North Africa, the Barbary, mass slavers of the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Okay. Millions and millions of Christians and Europeans are being enslaved.
Millions and millions?
Yeah, millions and millions.
Because I've looked into this a little bit. I think it was about 1 million.
No. Okay. Well, I think what you're citing is...
sorry. I mean the Barbary pirates alone. I'm not including what's going on.
The Barbary pirates between 1580 and 1780 or 1540, like in a 250-year period, up to 1.25 million. But that's just that. I'm talking about the Turks. I'm talking about the Crimeans. And you want to hear a little irony, a modern day development. So you're familiar with Barbary and what they did and how bad it was. And the worst slave market was in Algiers. Okay. And Algiers actually provoked and attacked the United States into its first war.
Yes, we covered this a little bit.
We did. But why it's interesting is on Christmas Eve, this last one, the Algerian parliament, in some kind of new law, scathing France, calling them evil criminal colonizers, and demanding reparations. And I think they overlook the irony that whatever France did during the colonial era, which you feel free to condemn all you want, that's fine. What about what you guys did for 3 centuries, actually enslaving Europeans and French and Americans? Where's the reparations there? So it just shows you the extreme hypocrisy.
They even conquered parts of England.
Lundy
Island.
Island, exactly. So
for 5 years, the Corsairs ran that,
and went to Iceland and Denmark, Ireland, Baltimore, and Ireland.
We talked at the beginning of this conversation a little bit about what was Islam in the imagination of the Europeans, but even if you go all the way to now, we're about almost 1,000 years later, aren't we? And so we're more than 1,000 years later. But if you also look at literature, so in the European imagination, certainly in the English imagination, we'd have thought about the Muslim pirates in North Africa or in coming from what we now call the Middle East as a serious threat. And this comes up in literature. Last time I think I mentioned with Daniel Defoe and Robinson Crusoe, he's captured by Corsair pirates. I picked up on this recently, but in Narnia, C.S. Lewis describes, I've forgotten what the southern enemy is called, but they have scimitars, and they're not explicitly Muslim, but it's all the imagery of this.
Tolkien too.
Tolkien did it as well. There's scimitars and the same side of the Southerners, I think they're called.
And Easterlings.
Easterlings, right. So this is in the literature and the imagination. I wonder if the English Rule Britannia song, "We Shall Never Be Slaves," has that in their imagination. Thomas Pellow was one of the Englishmen captured, I think, from Devon, and wrote diaries, which you can read his diaries.
No.
And he would have been very famous in England at the time. Daniel Defoe couldn't have done that book, which was a bestseller at the time, if being caught by made a slave wasn't in the English imagination. Cervantes. Yeah. Right, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Don Quixote, the author. Actually, you remind me of something funny that I was observing the other day, and I don't know if you have the same observation, but if you look at cartoons, from let's say the 60s and 50s, maybe even the 70s, but 50s, 60s, 40s, whatever, and you watch pirates, it would interest me as a kid. I'd be like, why do they always look swarthy and almost like, maybe a relative of mine? they, you know what I mean? They were always dark and a beard and no scimitar.
You have got a piratey vibe, actually. That does make a lot of sense.
Well, I don't have the beard anymore, but yeah, it'll be back. But so even in the cartoons, I think it was like Popeye cartoons. It was almost like carried like a cultural memory that a pirate was like an Arab or a Muslim
wearing turbans.
Yeah.
And
of course, it's lost now.
But the interesting thing is how it's lost, because even in Parliament, I mean, you can hear what Churchill talks about Muslims and Islam. William Gladstone, the Liberal PM in the 19th century, where he talks very scathingly about Islam. It's a very recent thing that the European imagination had felt differently, and now it seems like we're seeing a big shift again against Islam now. So we're seeing that it's almost like the blip in time was this period, maybe from the beginning of the 20th century to the end of the 20th century, maybe that sort of period. Why do you think that is? Why was there a change in attitude towards Islam? Do we have bigger problems? Was it the Second World War was such a big, First and Second World War was so big that we...
It's all the above. So one reason is, if Islam went from being this massive problem for a millennium to just being nothing, okay, it just like dissipated with let's say around 1800 or 1798, which is sort of the symbolic date where Napoleon goes and just immediately conquers Egypt, okay, and then the colonial era starts, and now Islam is just a spent force. So for a lot of Europeans, there's a great quote from Hilaire Belloc. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He was a prominent intellectual. I think he was born late 1800s, died maybe 1953. Wrote a lot about Islam. And he has this really important quote. I have it, I think, in Sword and Scimitar in my book, in the conclusion, where he basically says, I'm paraphrasing it, but pretty close. He says, the white race, the people of America and Europe and Australia, have forgotten all about Islam. And they just think, if anything, it's just a spent force, or it's a foreign religion, has nothing to do with me. And then he says, it is, as a matter of fact, our most persistent and dangerous enemy, and could at any moment flare out again, as it did historically. He wrote this around 1920, when Islam was, like I said, nothing, and the West was very powerful and dominant and all over the Middle East and Africa and Asia, colonizing. And so I mentioned that to you because, one, you had intelligent and prescient people who got it. Two, he was pointing out that most people, like you said, Islam was no longer a factor. It was more, European powers fighting each other, World War I, World War II. That's the real threat. And then when you move on now into the 50s and 60s, and you have this, the whole new, whatever word you want to give it, leftism, liberalism, wokeism now. And all of a sudden now, the bad guys are always the good guys, and the really bad guy is the white guy and the Christian, and the good guy is always the brown victim, okay? So, for example, you go into history and you talk about Islam and Europe, it's going to begin with the colonial era. They're going to act like everything before that, there was, Muslims were peaceful, or they really want to stretch back. They'll start it with the Crusades, out of context. None of what I told you.
Raymond Ibrahim goes a little bit further back than all of that.
Yeah, I like to provide the full picture. I like to give a little depth. So, so I think even in the academic world, they just haven't done justice to it. And it's been colored and marred by these liberal philosophies where, the noble savage myth, okay, where basically white, evil European and everyone else is good. That has become so ingrained. Okay. But I think now people, because you can only lie so much and pretend so much. And there's a reason for these fabrications, okay? And I'll give you a perfect example. Let's look at the Golden Age myth, without going into details. Why this argument, the Golden Age, even matters, and why academics make it.
This is the Golden Age of Islam.
Of Islam, right?
Which is what period? What are we talking about?
Well, usually there's two. The main one is the Abbasids, which I mentioned, which would be from, let's say, the 800 until 1200. I mean, that's the general year.
Out of Baghdad, is that?
Yeah, but from, let's say, 8, 9, and or to give them the centuries, 9th to like 11th or 12th centuries. In Baghdad.
And then there's the Cordoba.
Then the Cordoba in Spain, which is a little shorter. And the idea behind those...
Which is a bit later, is it?
No, it's length and time. It's under the Umayyads. It's around the same time.
Okay.
but it doesn't last as long, is what I mean. So the idea is that both of these, that this is the time where Muslims are inventing and they're advancing science and literature and language, while the savage Europeans are wallowing in their huts or
And there's
whatever.
some evidence for that, right? Because Cordoba was
yeah.
the biggest city in Europe, I think.
No, there is evidence. I don't deny that, these areas were definitely more, if you wish, civilized and more advanced with better science and technology and that sort of thing. But what we're not told, okay, is that the people doing this, because this is still very early on, and remember, when Muslims would conquer, it's not like everyone became a Muslim overnight. Places like Egypt were still Christian majority as late as maybe 13th and 14th century, okay? So why I tell you that
Really?
is because the people who were doing the Golden Age stuff were either Christians or Jews, or in Persia, which is where the Abbasids were, it was Persians, Zoroastrians, or nominal
Sorry,
converts.
when you say they're doing, those who are doing the achievements
that have
been
the Golden Age.
Okay, so what would be an example? Famous, give me some examples.
The names.
The stuff that comes out is algebra.
Algebra, and
you're saying that was not Muslims who were.
It was either.
It was Muslims.
No. It was either non-Muslims or it was nominal Muslims, which means it was a guy who would just, like yesterday was a Jew or a Christian or a Zoroastrian, but converted because that's what you do for social mobility. So if I convert tomorrow to Islam, whatever achievement I do, is it really something we can attribute to Islam or to what I've always been my whole life? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So that's the argument. Now, I'm not taking away from it. I'm just trying to say that, and this is not from me. There's a lot of, historians who are dedicated to this topic who've said the same thing. Okay, so I'm not giving you some sort of weird kind of Islamophobic thing. A lot of historians were very well credentialed to make this point, which is, it happened, but it happened despite Islam, not because of Islam. So you had a Muslim ruling elite, Arabs, and they allowed the people underneath them, because it was good for them, to engage in, in whatever discoveries and advancements, which benefited them anyway, and they would sponsor it. So that's all true. But it wasn't because of anything inherent to Islam. In fact, the more Islam started to be codified and ossified, because it wasn't codified at this point. There's this famous time, which is, I think, in the 11th century, where it's called the doors of Ijtihad closed. And Ijtihad means, or basically, the doors for free thinking in Islam closed, and it became literally ossified, okay, and more dogmatic. So the period we're talking about is before that. So there were contending schools of law. There were some that you would call liberal, okay, which is good. So again, it's a hard stretch. Here's the analogy I like to give, which may make sense. Imagine if you go to, the UAE, Dubai, and these places that have these massive skyscrapers, right? And great technology and impressive architecture, more impressive than a lot of things I see in the West. Okay. And then imagine it's hundreds of years from now and everything's been destroyed, but those things are still standing there. And the facts that we know is they're there, and we know that was a Muslim society. And then we conclude, you see what Islam did? Islam was responsible for grand architecture that the West could never rival. That's the logic it would be. But you and I know different. We know that, it's a Muslim nation. It bought it. It paid for Westerners to build it and to sponsor it. And it used its money, which it got from oil. And so that's what it really is. But you can see the temptation without knowing that, if we're just people in posterity and we look back, and we can say, well, you see what Islam created. Look at the wonders of Islam. It's standing in an Islamic region, this massive, skyscraper. So I think that analogy goes some way to explain the Golden Age. But the reason I wanted to bring it up to you is why the Golden Age myth matters. Why so much effort is put by a lot of academics and people to promulgate this. It's not because, we want to make Muslims feel good about themselves. I mean, that may be a superficial reason for some people, but it actually has a very practical effect. And it is this: if you believe that was the case, if you believe that somehow or other Muslims during, a certain period of time historically were more advanced, more progressive, more tolerant, more civilized than, let's say, Europeans and Westerners, then there is no way on earth we can ever say that when Muslims act the way they do now, jihad, terrorism, that sort of thing, that is innate to Islam, because it wasn't before. There was a time when Muslims were actually the progressive ones. So therefore, if Muslims are running around saying jihad and terrorism, that is not a reflection of Islam. That's actually a reflection of changing circumstances that are bringing out this bad stuff. That is why the Golden Age myth is so zealously guarded. It's to throw a wrench in the machinery. But if you know it's not true, then it's easy for someone like me to come and show you, well, look, they were doing jihad back then, and they're doing jihad today, and there's a straight line of continuity between the two. That makes sense. But if you believe that, no, there was a time when they were tolerant, then you can't say it's innate or intrinsic or inherent to the religion itself, this jihad business. That's why these narratives are created and so sacredly guarded.
Yes.
Even though if you really look at it, it doesn't...
It's rhetorically useful.
Yeah.
And it's to create arguments, particularly when there are Islamist attacks, as you say.
Yeah.
There's efforts to distance it from the spirit of Islam and say,
because
this is
look what they did,
extremism.
algebra,
Right. And part of that, they need to create a positive.
Right.
So there's a leaning into that.
And in a more flagrant but less successful and less subtle way is when they also try, and they were successful, to suppress the Islamic conquests of history, which I've been specializing in and talking about, because even that most people don't know. You know, if you know that, okay, if you know there's a terrorist screaming, Allah Akbar, and the Quran says kill you, but you're told that Islam spread peacefully through trade, well, then that guy doesn't really represent Islam. But if you find, no, that's exactly what Islam has done historically, then that guy does become an accurate representation of Islam. And they don't want you to think that. They always want you to think this guy is a rogue wolf. He's he hijacked Islam for his own evil purposes. But if you study the real history, you see, no, this guy is in a long line of continuous iterations.
Well, on that topic, actually, there was just a major Islamist attack foiled in Britain over Christmas. It reportedly would have been the biggest ever Islamist attack in Britain in our history, or certainly in our modern history. And the attackers wanted to attack Jews first and foremost, and then they said something along the lines of, once we've got the Jews, we'll go for the Crusaders. So as to our conversation, to tie it all together, certainly from these Islamist types, they carry the memory of the Crusaders perhaps closer than Christians do still today. And I was in Lebanon last summer and walked into a mosque in Baalbek. It was a Hezbollah mosque, and there was a sort of picture of Nasrallah, but there was a huge painting of a Christian crusader surrounded by Muslim armies, all sticking their scimitars and walking up. So the Crusaders, if it's not in the Western imagination, although it is also now increasingly in the Western imagination, not just at football games are they wearing Crusader kit or the Hospitallers kit. Was it the Hospitallers or the Templars?
I don't know. I think it's the Hospitallers.
There's more and more reference to that. They're wearing that sort of uniform at the protests we see around Britain now. So it's returning in the
it's never left the Muslims. You know, the Muslims, to their credit, they don't change. They say they have the same worldview, the same game plan. They know their history, even though they take liberties and, make themselves look like the good guys whenever they can. And that's kind of normal, I guess, for different peoples, except for Europeans who do the opposite, and they go out of their way to make their history look even worse than it was. But I think, for the longest time, it's the West that had forgotten its heritage, especially vis-a-vis Islam. But like you're saying, it's coming back. That memory is coming back. And it should be, it could be a good thing or a bad thing. I think it could be a good thing if it's channeled correctly.
Well, on that note, Raymond, it's been an absolute pleasure. Congratulations on the 2 Swords of Christ. I haven't read it yet, but I look forward to it. 5 centuries of a war between Islam and the warrior monks of Christendom. Part 3 in your series. I hope there's a part 4 and 5 and 6.
Oh, there's many more coming.
And I hope there's also a part 3 with you coming on
absolutely.
The show. If you've got the energy, I don't even know how we're doing for time, I'm going to invite you over to our Substack to take some quick questions from our loyal Substackers who I've got more questions for you than I think any other guest.
Okay.
You're a popular one. Is there anything else you'd like to bring viewers' attention to before we head over there?
Well, no, I think this has been rather comprehensive.
Wonderful. So, Raymond, thank you so much.
My pleasure.